Hello, I want to thank everyone so much for coming to this fifth session of the Capitoline seminars. We are all very honored and to have here with us Professor Dean Hammer from Franklin and Marshall College, US. But before I introduce him and let him speak, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Capitoline seminars and the dynamic of these lectures. The seminars are being organized by the Center for Studies on Political Thought, which is at least how we decided to translate what our Brazilian colleagues know as NAP, because we felt that it could be interesting to invite some scholars that we have a connection with here in the group and that would likely be available for giving lectures at this moment to exchange some ideas and bringing these different people together to talk about a common theme, which is Republic. Today, we have with us Professor Dean Hammer, who is about to deliver a lecture entitled Not with a Bang, but a Whimper, the Fall of the Roman Republic and the Crisis of American Democracy. Professor Hammer is a US political theory interested in the history of political thought, standing among the most distinguished and influential researchers in Roman political thought. He has published several articles and books on ancient and modern political theory, and I would like to highlight Roman Political Thought from Cicero to Augustine, published by Cambridge University Press, and Roman Political Thought and the Modern Theoretical Imagination, published by the University of Oklahoma. We are very honored to have you here with us today, Professor, and we're gonna have your lecture, and then we have some the moment to the audience to make questions that can make, they can make the questions in English if they want it, or they can type the question in Portuguese in the chat box, and Patterson, who is here with us, will translate with his cool British accent the questions for you, sir. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
And the British accent, among all accents, is the one that I have the hardest time understanding. So we're twice doomed in all of this. So I want to thank Tiago for the invitation to participate in the seminar, and for all of you for attending. And I hope this will be kind of interesting. It's going to touch on both Roman ancient politics as well as contemporary politics. And as we were talking before, I think you'll see that there's a whole lot about Brazil and Brazilian politics as well that we might want to think about and talk about. So you know, Trump is all the rage, and since his election in 2016, there's been a near daily analysis of some outrage or some personality defect or some parallel to totalitarianism. But I think these approaches misunderstand Trump as a cause rather than a symptom of a more fundamental crisis in American democracy, and in fact, in a number of other democracies across the globe. I want to widen the lens to gain some perspective on this crisis by looking at the transformations that occur in the final decades of the Roman Republic. There is a fundamental paradox that lies at the heart of the slow demise of the Roman Republic. Why does the system collapse when, as many scholars have noted, there's nothing that suggests that there was ever an intention by anyone to overthrow the Republic? There's not a crisis that marks the fall of the Republic. There's not a coup. There's not even a clearly observable moment when the Republic stops being the Republic. But I think understanding this paradox is key to identifying what Rome might have to say to us today. There have been two primary approaches to addressing this paradox, both of which hinge on different conceptions of politics. The predominant view identifies particular objective conditions that are seen as causing or determining political outcomes. In the case of Rome, scholars have largely focused on the structural inability of its institutions to address the issues caused by imperial expansion. From this perspective, the resolution to the paradox of how the Republic falls without anyone intending for it to happen is that conditions overwhelm any decisions that could be made. A second approach, and one developed largely in response to the first approach, sees politics as a contingent affair dominated by influential individuals. From this perspective, the Republic collapses because of miscalculations by a few powerful individuals. Neither approach, though, is entirely satisfactory. The choice of which structures to pay attention to often has a tautological aspect to it. Viewed over a sufficiently long arc of time and from a sufficient distance, outcomes appear to have a certain inevitability, if only because it is the only outcome that occurs. Those outcomes are attributed to certain conditions. But these conditions, in talking about Rome, do not explain why politics fails at one time and not another, why it survives the 80s, but not the 40s, for example, or to push the potential crisis back even further, why the Republic survives the numerous conflicts between the patricians and plebes. Yet the alternative of focusing on contingency is no more satisfactory. This approach simply locates the cause in the actor in the moment when everything appears contingent. We can all make choices, but actions occur in a context. While individuals may capitalize on, exacerbate, or mitigate conditions, they do not themselves create the conditions that make particular decisions possible, viable, or impactful. I'm suggesting a different approach, one that draws on phenomenology. One of the insights of phenomenology is that political institutions and conditions do not have an objective importance or meaningfulness apart from our experience of them. That experience has both a social and a temporal dimension. From a social perspective, the framework of politics, which includes everything from formal institutions to extra-institutional outlets, is oriented less by rules or laws or procedures, and more by the norms, understandings, and goals of the actors. John Dewey commented almost a century ago that democracy is an ethos. That is, it is an attitude and belief, not just about institutions, but also about the less visible dispositions necessary for those institutions to survive, such as trust or transparency or reciprocity. The second dimension of experience that defines the political is temporal. One's experience of the present, what is salient to us, how it is understood, what we're concerned about, what we're not concerned about, is neither self-determined nor objectively defined, but acquires meaning against both particular remembrances of the past and anticipations of the future. It is about how we place ourselves between past and future and how we anticipate or understand that future. We can thus understand politics as a particular orientation of sociality and temporality. Politics exists as an encounter of individuals within a framework, guided by implicit understandings about how to work within this framework, in which questions about the future of the community arise and are decided. That's pretty conceptual. So I'll tell you what the sort of the upshot of this is for our understanding of politics and the perspective that it gives on the fall of Rome. What changes in the final decades of the Roman Republic is a view of political institutions as less and less able to project the community into the future. This change is not because the institutions are structurally incapable of addressing a set of issues, but because of an erosion of belief or trust in the norms that provide the background context by which individuals working through institutions can get things done. That is, we stop believing in them, and that further erodes the trust and the belief in them. This has implications for how politics is experienced. The erosion of these norms not only disable these institutions, making these institutions seem less and less able to project the community into the future, but also makes alterations in the political framework possible that might have been inconceivable before. In particular, one sees the elevation of individuals who offer solutions by promising to bypass these ineffective and unresponsive institutions. The approach I'm suggesting here helps us understand both a pattern of decisions and the corrosive effect of these decisions on the Republic. It also provides a different way of thinking about how we make comparisons, not by looking at particular structural similarities or identifying specific personalities, but by bringing to awareness the often invisible background assumptions that orient political actors. The point of comparison is not to map events in Rome onto those of the United States, but to gain some insight into how frail participatory Republican institutions can be. I argued in my last book that one of the real insights of Roman political thought lies not in their analysis of formal institutional or constitutional arrangements, as it was frequently assumed, but in the recognition of the norms by which these institutions functioned. In the Roman case, these norms were forged in a long and historically contentious process, notably between patricians and plebes, that put in place a set of institutional functions and relations governed as much by informal norms as any formal attributes. In fact, I would suggest more by informal norms than by any formal attributes. There's a Senate whose official functions were few, but whose informal powers were enormous. Assemblies that lacked the power of initiative or amendment, but nonetheless whose looming importance even Cicero would acknowledge. And the tribunes that served, in a sense, as the people's magistrates, able to propose as well as veto legislation. Of particular interest for us are the rules and norms that regulated the relationship of the tribunate to the assembly, consuls, and most importantly, the Senate, since these relationships are the key to understanding Rome as a republic. Couple of norms. First, the office of tribune existed to serve the people, which was an artifact of its origins as a response to large-scale public strikes. Second, a tribune's body was considered sacrosanct, protected from violence or force, and enforced by a pledge of the plebeians to kill any person who harmed or interfered with a tribune. Third, the tribunes normally introduced laws with the approval of or not in downright opposition to the Senate. Fourth, the tribunes had the power to veto, an ability to intercede that derived from their sacrosanctity. And finally, discussions were allowed to proceed for and against a proposal before a tribune invoked a veto. These norms worked for several hundred years, though not always smoothly, not only to give people voice in the political system, but also to mediate some of the conflict between patricians and the plebeians. What in my mind is the most consequential long-term development in the Republic is the increasing attack on both the informal norms and the formal rules that regulated these political relationships. What emerged was a strategy of obstruction and then strategies of circumventing this obstruction that ultimately undermined the integrity of these political institutions to, in essence, get things done. 133 BCE is a significant moment in this history. A tribune, Marcus Octavius, threatens a veto against the agrarian legislation of another tribune and one-time companion, Tiberius Gracchus, before it is debated. The actions violated two norms: the norm of the tribune as representative of the plebeians, and the norm against using a veto to prevent a bill from being read. That was precipitated in part by the violation of a third norm, that of introducing legislation without some prior agreement of the Senate. Tiberius in turn threatens to depose the tribune, which is a nice way of saying that the crowd would physically drive him away, thus undermining another norm, the principle of sacrosanctity. The events of 133 are neither a blip nor a cause, but an indicator of the growing dissensus surrounding fundamental policy questions and the method by which and from whom support was sought. I am, of course, speaking about what in shorthand is referred to as the division between the optimates and the populares. What these terms stand for is complicated, but I just want to suggest that most of all, they are names associated with other terms that reflected a growing polarization within the political system among the elite between two different sources of support, one from the Senate, the other from the people, and two different methods of acquiring that support, one by preserving inequalities in private property, the other by distributing material benefits. Regardless of the terms used, what we see in these final decades of the Republic is an increasing polarization in how the other side is viewed. There is a vacating of the middle. The result is a lack of suppleness in the ability of institutions to see and respond to situations. I doubt if 133 was the beginning, the moment when norms collapsed, but it altered the background assumptions about what was possible and permissible, inaugurating a strategy of obstruction and increasing the questionable means of overcoming that obstruction. Havia sees 133 as marking a change from earlier struggles between the plebeians and patricians that were confined by law and norms, and later conflict that was restrained by neither. The system made obstruction easy. There is the increasing employment of, excuse me, there is the increasing employment of Senate-friendly tribunes to veto acts. Senate-friendly tribunes could filibuster, as Cato does to block Caesar's request to run for consul even while absent. Religious omens could be employed to block legislation. The Senate could withhold funds, as they did to thwart Tiberius Gracchus's agrarian legislation. The Senate could declare legislation to be against the interest of the res publica, as they did against Saturninus's grain bill. Solo likely restricted the ability of tribunes to introduce and veto legislation. He also prevented anyone who held a tribunate from holding subsequent magisterial offices, thus blocking the tribunate as a path to political leadership. One also sees the overturning of earlier legislation, which happens with the agrarian law of Gracchus and annulments against an agrarian bill by Sextus Tatius in 99, in 91 against Marcus Livius Drusus, against Sulpicius in 88, against an agrarian bill by Marcus Junius Brutus, possibly in 83, and against Manilius's law to enroll freemen into rural tribes in 67. The overturning of legislation plays a subtle but significant role in these final decades, since it undermines a belief, one near and dear to the Romans, of the authorizing role of the past in guiding future decisions. There is not one statistic that captures these changes, and it is not even that the Senate and Assembly stopped functioning. In fact, it is often more revealing of the dysfunction when something was actually done and how it was done. When Caesar proposed a law for some land redistribution in April of 60, he was met with the silence of the Senate. Caesar then chose to forego the practice of informal Senate approval, refusing to call it together for the remainder of the year, taking the legislation directly to the people, at which point Bibulus, the elder consul, attempted to suspend all public discussion for the year by declaring a sacred period. Caesar ignored that as well, calling for an assembly, even though 3 tribunes had threatened to veto. Bibulus is pushed down the stairs, the 3 tribunes are beaten, and a vote is taken. Caesar then carried out several more laws that the Senate had earlier obstructed, all while Bibulus looked to the skies for omens. The story I'm telling here is confirmed by Kelly Williamson's data on the functioning of public law. Williamson notes 2 changes of significance for this discussion. First was that what she refers to as competitive lawmaking, where laws were used to annul earlier laws in order to promote a particular agenda. The second is a change in the focus of legislation, from maintaining the conditions for the exercise of the collective will of the Roman people to increasing attempts to address deviations from conventions, particularly things like bribery. The way I read this, these were attempts to formalize norms after they were lost. The upshot of this ongoing obstruction was man, my throat is really dry today. The upshot of this ongoing obstruction was a loss of belief in traditional institutions as mechanisms for mediating division and solving problems. Stated slightly differently, traditional politics became less and less the forum in which the community could decide what it wanted to be. The tribunate had turned against itself. Consuls too clashed with tribunes. The Senate was not perceived as any better. Salsa's description of the Senate dithering as a way of disguising their own complicity with Jugurtha is revealing. The ensuing decades read as accumulating experiences of political dysfunction. The social war, the gutting of the powers of the tribunate and senior senators by Sulla, the insurrection by Lepidus, the revolt led by Spartacus that took years for the Republic to suppress, the failure to deal with piracy, the resulting inflation and food riots that were aimed at the Senate for hesitating and giving Pompey an extended command, corruption, the Capitoline conspiracy, and the growing problem of landless soldiers all undermine confidence in Rome's institutions. And thus, we see experiments in autocracy, a casting about for solutions outside these institutional norms, extended commands, consecutive consulships, interreges because of election demands, consulships without holding any previous elected office, consulships without a colleague, the bypassing of the Senate by consuls, triumvirates, and dictatorships. Yet to the end, and this goes to the intention of actors,
The idea of a king was anathema to both elites and the people. Caesar refused the title when it was proposed by Antony. Instead, claims were always couched in terms of defending the res publica. Cicero's language, arguing for the extraordinary appointment to command to Pompey, is revealing of the search for solutions detached from traditional institutions. The language is particularly surprising given Cicero's own devotion to the res publica. First is Cicero's statement that the normal succession of command would not solve the problem of Mithridates, one of Rome's foremost enemies. Rather, as Cicero continues, one man is universally desired and demanded by citizens and allies alike as the commander for this war. One and the same commander is feared by the enemy, and they fear none but him. Second is Cicero's characterization of Pompey as a superhuman genius of a single man, as an angel from heaven, and as having miraculous power. Finally, Cicero emphasizes the unmediated acclaim for Pompey. As Cicero states, "Think you indeed that there was anywhere a coast so desolate that no tidings reached it of that great day on which the entire Roman people, thronging into the forum and filling every temple that commands a view of the platform, demanded the appointment of Pompey alone to be their general in a world war?" The importance of these plebiscitary aspects is that acclamation and authority bypass institutions, suggesting a direct and unmediated relationship between the people and the leaders. That is what Caesar would do as well. There was a further weakening of attachments to these traditional institutions as they become less and less important as avenues of recognition. Traditionally, the path to prestige and distinction lay in competition for electoral office, receiving triumphs, and acquiring membership in priestly colleges. But elites begin to develop their own power through extra institutional means, raising their own armies and providing largesse to loyalists, which require the formation of interlocking networks of wealth and connections. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, for example, or Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus after that. It is not that these institutions are irrelevant. Rather, their role is increasingly to accede to, even celebrate, the extraordinary individual. I don't want to abbreviate history too much here, but by the time Octavian seizes power and becomes Augustus, the only viable political language available was that of individuals, not institutions. I think Tacitus is absolutely correct and deeply insightful when he characterizes the quiet that accompanies the rise of the Principate, the Whimper that I referred to in the title. The Senate could only sit by after Pompey and Caesar ignored their overwhelming vote for them to simultaneously give up their commands. Cicero can only sputter at Antonius bypassing the Senate and turning to the popular assemblies now deprived of the people. Cato can only kill himself. It isn't abrupt. It isn't a violent takeover or revolution. It is a slow depletion of the norms that sustained a Roman participatory system until, in the end, there was nothing to animate a Republican spirit. It is this narrative that I think has echoes in and warnings for our own democracy. And it's not simply a coincidence. Both Rome and the United States had fairly stable participatory systems, and both shared political institutions designed to frustrate quick change. Under the best of circumstances, passing legislation is complicated. Moreover, like in Rome, the different institutions function by way of a variety of traditions. Oversight of the executive branch, the nonpartisanship of civil servants, the independence of the judiciary, the filibuster in which 1/3 of the Senate can block action, and probably the most significant norm of the Senate was some level of bipartisanship. But that has changed, and it has changed for some of the same reasons that we saw in Rome, a growing dissensus within the United States. What has emerged over the last decades, and it echoes what happens in Rome, is negative partisanship, a division born of dislike for and distrust of the other. There are all sorts of indicators of this dissensus, all sorts of graphs that show that sharp ideological division, that there's no overlap between particular leaders. The most interesting one for me, though, is that 40% of people from each party would disapprove of their child marrying someone from the other party. I think that percentage is actually much higher now and probably understates how the animus that exists within the citizenry. The result is a change in orientation toward these political institutions, from seeing them as mechanisms for mediating disagreement to using them to stop the other side, to obstruct action. Like 133 in Rome, 2008 was a watershed moment in the United States, but was several decades in coming. On the day of Barack Obama's inauguration, the Republican leadership met and agreed that they would block everything, not because they agreed or disagreed with particular proposals, but for the explicit purpose of rendering the president ineffective. And they held to their word. The Republican Senate, over the 8 years of his term, delayed appointments, refused to fill appointments, prevented hearings for appointments, and stopped legislation from ever coming up for a vote. Like 133 BCE in Rome, 2008 reflected more an acceleration of a set of trends toward the obstruction already in motion. Once the Republicans won back the Senate, they no longer had to filibuster. They simply stopped legislation passed in the House from coming forward. We only have to look at today to realize how little is getting done because of an avowed disdain for working with the other side. And in fact, political leaders, representatives will lose elections because they're seen as having worked with someone else. The problem is not structural. It is not about the capacity of institutions to address problems. Like in the final century of the Roman Republic, it is an overt refusal to work together to address the profound economic and social issues facing the country. The impact on how people understand our political institutions is staggering. And in fact, if we had polls of the Roman Republic in the years following Sulla, my guess is we would have similar numbers. Only 19% of Americans trust the government always or most of the time. Striking is people's sense of the future. When asked to look 5 years ahead, 78% said that either the country will be just as politically divided as it is now or more divided. The statistic is stunning because it points to how people imagine their institutions as able or unable to project the community into the future. Moreover, 75% of respondents believe that trust in government is decreasing, 64% believe that trust in each other is decreasing, and similar proportions view this loss of trust in government and each other makes it harder to solve problems. That is, no one trusts anyone. The Democracy Index of 2016 downgraded American democracy from a full democracy to a flawed one because of a trust deficit that was years in the making. The loss of belief in the system underlies the willingness to undermine aspects of that system. Within institutions, rules get changed either out of frustration or out of a sense that the norms are just not that important. For example, the Senate Democrats momentarily suspended the filibuster rule to finally get some of Obama's judicial appointments through. Out of exasperation, President Obama resorted to executive orders, including conferring legal status on millions of undocumented immigrants. The Senate Majority Leader McConnell did what everyone used to think was unthinkable, but no Republican opposed: to block for a year a hearing and a vote on a Supreme Court justice appointee by President Obama, and then to suspend the filibuster in order to confirm a different nominee for that position once Trump was elected. The willingness to toss away norms extends to the general populace. A 2019 study shows an increasing number of Republicans, from 14% in 2016 to 43% in 2019, who believe that the country's problems would be better addressed if presidents, quote, didn't have to worry about Congress or the courts. Think about that. That is actually the very basis of our constitutional system, is thinking about Congress and the courts. Institutional actors don't trust each other and thus undermine the capacity of institutions to get things done. Citizens don't trust the institutions and they don't trust each other and thus look for solutions outside these institutions and outside of some more popular sort of form of democracy. Trumpism grows out of these anti-institutional trends, representing an experiment with one form of autocracy, which I would describe as a new Caesarism. In using this phrase, I'm not equating Trump with Caesar, nor am I suggesting that there is an ineluctable, irreversible path toward autocracy, any more in the United States than it was for Rome. Rather, I'm seeking to characterize a political movement that blends populist and authoritarian impulses. My interest is to show how the characteristics of this new Caesarism, the authorization by acclamation toward individuals who seek not to save political institutions, but to surpass or bypass them, how this new Caesarism grows out of the loss of norms by which political institutions can get things done. Dio Cassius reports that the people declared Caesar to be the savior of the citizens. Less relevant for us here is the association of a leader with the divine, which had a history in Rome that does not have the same cultural resonance in the United States. What I'm more interested in thinking through is the political context that gives credence to this sort of language. The rise of Caesar, like Pompey before, occurs in a context in which traditional institutions are perceived, even by those in the institutions, as unable to address a future that is seen in some sense as apocalyptic. For Rome, that perspective is forged in economic crisis and tumultuous violence. For the United States, it is grounded in a cultural schism, fostered in a variety of media outlets, of a country under siege by minorities, immigrants, internationalists, the financial elite, and the deep state. The institutions are not simply effective. The institutions appear as the enemy. Trump ran on and continues on a daily basis to challenge the integrity of almost every political institution and process. Congress, the media, the courts, civil servants, the FBI, intelligence officers, the military, international organizations, the electoral system, and most recently, his own Centers for Disease Control amidst a pandemic. Conspiracy theories now receive presidential endorsements, not the least of which is a notion of a deep state out to destroy Trump. But these are not just a list of different conspiracies. Trump is speaking to more existential questions about the future, and I think one that appears in other countries. How does one maintain one's livelihood in the face of economic dislocation? And how does one maintain one's collective identity in the face of globalization? Absent any confidence by the people in other people to rule, the alternative offered is that of the individual who will act as the people's unmediated voice and bypass these institutions. Trump's language speaks always to his direct authorization by the people. I am your voice, he declared in his acceptance speech, which is a statement that makes one voice out of the plural voices of a democracy. Every public event involving Trump appears as a version of a Roman triumph, as a public reaffirmation of a claim. One gets an early sense of his consuming interest in demonstrating the extent of this acclaim when Trump lied about the numbers who attended his inauguration, claiming they were the largest ever. They were not, and expressing outrage at the photographs illustrating the smaller numbers who were actually in attendance. He actually then pressured the Park Service to find evidence that would support his claims. He filled an otherwise serious intelligence ceremony with cronies at one point, who gave him a standing ovation and applauded on cue. And he signed a proclamation naming his inauguration day a National Day of Patriotic Devotion. The proclamation is telling. It makes Trump's own election into a statement of patriotism. And in fact, he stated that Democrats who did not applaud his economic news at the State of the Union were un-American and treasonous. The assumption of this voice is premised on Trump's own exemplary characteristics, not as a military leader, as it was in the case of Rome, but as a businessman. Speaking in a language of superlatives that recalls Cicero's praise of Pompey and Caesar's praise of himself, Trump incessantly describes himself and demands others describe him in superlatives of greatness, as a genius, as having the greatest memory of all time, as being the healthiest president ever, and as being the most successful president ever. Referring to a speech he recently made in Poland, Trump said, and I'm quoting here, "I have had the best reviews on foreign land. So I go to Poland and I make a speech. Enemies of mine in the media, enemies of mine are saying it was the greatest speech ever made on foreign soil by a president." And just recently, at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, Trump said before others at the Centers for Disease Control, actual doctors trained in pandemics, he says, and I'm quoting, "People are really surprised I understand this stuff," adding, "Every one of these doctors said, 'How do you know so much about this? Maybe I have a natural ability.'" The point I want to make here is not that Trump claims a mandate or seeks applause. All presidential victors do that. Rather, this acclamation, as it arises from the distrust of our institutions, is directed at further subverting these Republican norms and institutions. There are two ways in which institutions and institutional norms get bypassed. One way is through unilateral action. Trump began his first month with a flurry of executive order mandates, and such orders remain the primary mechanism of policymaking, each of them dramatically publicized. Obama had famously made use of executive orders in the face of partisan divide in which there was obstruction of the normal process of legislation. The partisan divide remains under Trump, but what is significant in the cases under Trump is that the orders are aimed at invalidating and delegitimating earlier actions, much like what happened with the nullification of laws in the late Republic, thus disrupting any notion of continuity or any sense in which the past is related or connected to the future. A second and more critical aspect of bypassing institutions is to change their orientation from a notion of public service to personal loyalty. There's actually a constitutional guise to this reorientation in an interpretation that began in conservative circles several decades ago called Unitarianism. Unitarianism is a theory that the executive branch is a unitary entity directed by the will of the president. As the current Attorney General stated, a Unitarian himself, the president alone is the executive and is the sole repository of all executive powers conferred by the Constitution. What is instructive here is the implications that proponents draw from this argument, that the president has complete discretion to act on cases that involve his own interests, and in fact, cannot engage in conflict of interest since there is only one interest in the executive branch. A claim of absolute immunity from congressional oversight of the president, and by extension, oversight of former aides, claims of unilateral war-making powers, absolute authority to implement and execute laws, and the rejection of any legislative attempts to create independent administrators. The constitutional theory made various appearances over the last couple of decades, notably in the torture justifications under the Bush administration. Under the Trump administration, though, the claim has become full-throated and unabashed in spelling out the implications. The implication, and Trump has been quite explicit about this, is that if the executive is conceived as a unitary will, then the unifying ethos of all those who make up the unitary executive is not public integrity, but personal loyalty. Just how pervasive the changes have been is really hard to capture, but I will try to suggest the enormity. A 100-year tradition of nonpartisan independence of civil servants has now been gutted. Expertise has been replaced by loyalists, dissent is seen as traitorous, and in fact, employees are expected to pledge their loyalty. The Department of Justice has been transformed from the people's attorney to Trump's. Notably, Attorney General Barr intervened to change the sentencing recommendations for one of Trump's friends, leading to the resignation of federal attorneys working on the case. Trump had fired federal attorneys who were involved in investigations of his corruption, and he personally interviewed the federal attorneys in critical jurisdictions, which wasn't illegal, it was just odd. Trump has instructed those in the administration not to cooperate with legislative oversight or any subpoenas. Subverting the norms of military discipline and command, Trump recently pardoned 2 war criminals and restored the rank of a 3rd. And to further disorient the norms of service, Trump has called Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who testified at the impeachment trial, very insubordinate, and has followed through with a barrage of attacks against him, eventually driving him out of the military. Just recently, Trump commuted a sentence of a person who refused to provide state's evidence against him. That action, by the way, was actually considered and then ruled out as unthinkable by the Nixon administration, the previous high water mark of corruption in the United States. And he was impeached for essentially shaking down the Ukraine president, withholding congressionally approved weapons until they produced dirt on his opponent. One of his lawyers, Alan Dershowitz, argued in the impeachment trial, though later claiming to be misinterpreted, and I quote, "If the president does something that he thinks will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be a kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment." That is to say, his interests are the nation's interests. Trump's actions are significant enough. But the real story I am telling is of the broader indifference to the loss of these institution-sustaining norms. There has been no reaction by Republicans to Trump's open defiance of their power of oversight and consultation, let alone the broader issues of corruption and legality. Instead, as if reenacting the scene painted by Tacitus of the senators struggling to outdo each other in their flattery upon their flattering of Augustus's on Augustus's death, the Republicans adopted and continued to employ the language of acclaim, his genius or flawlessness or perfect genes. I'm not kidding. Secretary Mnuchin said that would make Cicero blush. The best case we can make for this effusive flattery is that it is disingenuous, employed as a way of making Trump a vehicle of their ambition, or driven more likely by fear of retribution. And to a certain extent, that is precisely what I'm saying. It is not that any of these flatterers yearn for autocracy. They are the same people who only a few years ago decried Obama as a lawless tyrant. But the language, whether employed for individual policy or partisan ends, is important because it reorients how the public conceives of political action, shifting the arena of action from messy processes of debate and deliberation to tidy declarations of a will. The story I'm telling is of the depletion of norms by which political institutions are able to function, leading to both a loss of belief in these institutions and a willingness to embrace solutions that promise to bypass these institutions. I want to reiterate that this embrace is not motivated necessarily by a desire for autocracy. It is driven by any number of motivations: personal ambition, interest, ideology, partisanship, fear, even policy beliefs. But what is subordinate to these motivations is a belief that certain institution-sustaining norms are particularly important or worth articulating. The gradual erosion of these norms not only affects the functioning of these institutions, but also how we conceive of these institutions. I want to circle back to the Roman Republic briefly here to give some perspective on what is at stake and how a republic defines itself. The term republic derives from the Latin word res publica, which translates as a thing of the people. What this meant for Cicero is that the state is the property of the people, operating as a type of partnership on behalf of its owners. To be sure, the reality has always been different, both here and in Rome. But something significant happens in Rome. Stripped of their meaningfulness as public things, Roman institutions were up for grabs with few constraints or norms left in place to direct the behavior. We see in Rome the gradual reorientation of public institutions toward private and personal ends, culminating in Augustus's redefinition of the state as a type of household rule. We do not have a princeps, nor will we have one. What we do have in our experiment with autocracy is complicity with a president who is gradually transforming public institutions into a version, and actually a literal version, of an extended household that eschews public accountability. What underlies this complicity is the erosion of a more general belief that the integrity of public institutions matter. By that I mean that there is a changing sense about what public institutions are for. They are not about public ends, but in its crassest sense, about the distribution of spoils. To return to Rome for a moment, I think that when Tacitus describes the unsettled quiet of the aristocracy with the fall of the Republic, he is pointing to the loss of any real belief that the Republic could viably project itself into the future. They may not have wanted Octavian, or they decided Octavian worked to their interests, but there was very little individuals could do when the norms that gave life to these institutions had collapsed. The media continually talks about the red line where Republicans will stop Trump. But what I am suggesting here is that there is no line that would be based on anything democratic, because there is no longer a belief in the norms upon which a line could be drawn. Moreover, whether Trump succeeds or fails, whether he's impeached or reelected, is also not the point. Trump's rise or fall, any more than the rise or fall of the Gracchus, Marius, Sulla, Cinna, Pompey, Lepidus, Antonius, and Caesar, leaves in place the erosion of democratic norms that animate our institutions, an erosion that has been advanced or at least complicitly allowed by the major institutional leaders of the country and the citizenry. We can talk about Trump's narcissism or decry the various outrages, and we can look to protest or to the courts at points to step in. But it is suggestive of the depth of the problem that the biggest challenger to Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side, and in this past primary as well, drew on these same anti-institutional sentiments. It took the Roman Republic 100 years to eventually collapse. We are only about 10 years in. But the experience of the Roman Republic is that it isn't clear how one reverses the collapse of norms, how one restores faith in the invisible. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor. That's a really interesting talk, and I must say that the really interesting part is, I'm sorry to say that, is about U.S. nowadays, and there's several similar things in U.S. and Brazil today, as we have some things that we can see that goes in different directions. And I think that for all of us that were like historians of the political thought, is always even if we have some suggestions that we're not supposed to learn with the past, the exactly path to solve our problems, but at least we can think about it. And for start, I have a question. I don't know if anyone else wants to make a question, or how do we do right now? Anyone? Or go ahead, Patterson.
All right then. Hi, Professor. I'm sorry that I haven't got a camera here, so I'll be talking from the dark here. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for this talk. It was very enriching. I was thinking how analysis on class and oppression are important to that kind of insight on the loss of faith in institutions. Because if the Republic goes with a whimper, then what goes with a bang, right? I was thinking, and recently, just for one example, we have seen that the death of George Floyd has produced quite a bang, hasn't it? So isn't the whimper an effect of the fact that Republican institutions are usually mostly a game of elites, right? Like, a few might care deeply, ideologically, even about the fall of institutions, but a lot of people had gotten the short shift before, don't care very much, right? So if we get, for instance, and even as Tiago was talking about Brazil, right? So if we get, for instance, racial oppression in Brazil, right? And how it carried on in the country for decades until today, after the abolition, right? How a government does to marginalized populations all over the territory what it used to do to the middle class during the dictatorship. So it is easy to see why so many people, even marginalized ones, even marginalized populations, they don't care. They don't come to care about these institutions so much to the point where they kind of support ideologies that go against it nowadays. So, I mean, in the end, what I'm saying is not new in any sense, but I wonder how it connects with your more institutional take of the problem of the fall of republics. That's what I was wondering. Thank you.
Oh no, I think I think you're absolutely correct. There is being left out of the system. Right, there's two responses to it. One is that you work your way into the system, and the other is that you break down the system or take over the system. I think actually, interestingly enough, I think that the protests, for example, after Floyd's death, have actually followed the norms of democratic citizenship. And in fact, earlier than that, the Women's March that occurred after Trump's election set in motion a set of women entering into political office that was designed to reform, but it was to reform things within the system. And thus, if you noticed if you look at in the U.S. news and talk about the pandemic, it is striking how many women are now the mayors of our largest cities. Atlanta, Chicago, Phoenix, or one of the Arizona places, an extraordinary number of women who entered in out of a sense of being sort of left out of things. And so in many ways, I think that they and the Floyd protesters are attempting to work within the confines of the system to change aspects of that system, which desperately need to be changed. What is the group that is actually, sort of goes along with what you're talking about, the group that I think that has had the most animus to democratic norms, or at least the least understanding of democratic norms, is actually a class group, and that is a white, sort of lower class, situated in rural and primarily in rural areas in the South, and that is the group that has been driving a lot of Trump, and is the major source of the supporters. And there you have sort of a disinterest in what a democracy looks like, and a disinterest in what the change in norms looks like, and a disinterest in the types of ways in which one needs to govern, to be able to compromise, for example, to be able to work together to solve particular problems. So I think interestingly, the dispossessed here, like the dispossessed in Rome, actually have not been the major source of sort of norm and rule breaking behavior, but it's rather the active citizen that feels in some sense disenfranchised, but quite frankly isn't, that is acting out a set of impulses. That is right. So it's not revolution. It's not revolution. It's in fact, I mean, I can point to cases where politics collapse in a bang, and I'll give you an example of one of the and a reason why, for example, African Americans should be particularly annoyed with the system. So civil rights action essentially gets put off for decades in the late 50s and 60s because of the filibuster rule in the Senate. Now, the filibuster rule isn't a law. It's simply a way in which they regulate themselves. And it was designed to sort of create, some sense of compromise that could go on. And there were a sufficient number of senators who were strongly in support of civil rights, people like Hubert Humphrey, who never thought to simply postpone the filibuster rule and to make it simply a majority decision. That's striking because now at the drop of the hat, they change rules all the time that were normally kind of norms of recognition that there was another side in this particular debate. So if there was any group that should want to tear down the system, it should be African Americans, because the system hasn't worked very well for them. And yet I don't see them doing it, but rather in making some, in particular, going at the local levels and changing some of the conduct in cities, which affects them most dramatically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marley wants to make a question, but I'm going to use my executive powers as the host of this meeting to goes first. Yeah. And I want to go, as I start to say before, there's Rome, the fall of the Roman Republic, and let's say that we have different crises, both in US and Brazil right now. That's, as I told before, there's a kind of similarities and something that put those crises in different directions. And you showed us some data that suggest that there's a kind of erosion in the trust or in the institutions in the US right now. There's a lack of a lower level of trust between persons. But let me tell you that in Brazil, that's our reality for a long time already. We are well known for a country with a lower level of social trust. I don't know if you can say that, but we don't trust each other exactly. And we can feel that when we go to US and we check like relations in business and stuff like that, we have to sign several different papers in here in Brazil, and in US sometimes it's just enough for you to say a word and something like that. And also we have a huge suspicion attitude toward institutions, let's say that.
Mm-hmm.
That's to say we had our republic we expelled the king in 1889, and since then we have kind of two tyrannies in the way we are right now in what we can call the Third Republic, that was put together by a new constitution in 1988. But the thing is, here in Brazil, we have this kind of the same kind of a prophet or a new Caesar, saying, forget about the institutions, forget about the powerful people, forget about those phantom interests, and trust in me. And our president has his second name as Messias, that translated into English is Messiah. And he already used that, I'm a Messiah or something like that. And some of their supporters think that he is a sign of God's will or something like that. So if you pick that situation with this lack of trust in institutions and two tyrannies in the 20th century, one thing that we already talked, and unfortunately more every day, is that we're going to survive. And I'm going to make that question for you, in your perspective as a US citizen, as a US political theorist, or someone who's paying attention in the reality. I don't believe that you have the same question being made every single day, because you have this lower level of trust in institution. Your republic is being like a republic since the late 18th century. You don't have these episodes of tyranny and that we faced for the last 100 years. So US, you will survive. And I know that you have elections in a few months, and the sign is that you will survive and even change the president. At least the poll shows that right now. But the institutions, it will survive the rise of those new Caesars, because one thing that I can, for different reasons, nor Bolsonaro or Trump, they don't have legions. They are not like Mario or Sulla or even Caesar. They don't have legions for different reasons. That's more and more clear in Brazil, that the army is not behind Bolsonaro as a supporter for any kind of tyrannic or authoritarian adventure.
Mm-hmm.
So US democracy will survive Trump's adventure.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of sort of issues that I jotted down as you were talking. The analog between Bolsonaro and Trump is it's just striking, and you see this actually in some other autocrats around the world. It's the evangelical right, proclaims him as a prophet, even though he upholds no actual value that they actually have. So you see that sort of language, going on. I think you are correct that we have no actual experience of tyranny. There's nothing. Whereas in Rome, there's at least a constitutional sort of allowance for some of that. And I would be very surprised if something like that happened, because I think you're right, it is not part of a tradition or even a mindset of how American democracy works. I think there's a different issue. I think there's a different consequence. and that is it's sort of a state capacity consequence. If you look at Fukuyama just wrote about this in the Atlantic, and I think in Foreign Affairs. If you look at the countries that have successfully responded to the pandemic, it's not because they have more money or for this reason or that reason. It's because they have more trust. They have more trust in their government to do things. They believe what the government says, and that increases state capacity, the ability of institutions to actually solve problems. The countries that have had the poorest response to the pandemic, Brazil, the United States, and the Soviet Union, have the lowest state capacity because they have the lowest sort of trust or belief in what the government can do and whether or not the government can solve particular problems. And so the issue may not be do we face tyranny? And by the way, it's as likely to come from the left as the right, as someone coming in to try to run over particular norms. The problem, it seems to me, is more the inability to solve problems, and thus we may come back very quickly to Peterson's question, right? Because the inability to solve problems is, among other things, the inability to solve the enormous inequities of wealth, the inability to solve police violence, the inability to solve the urban crises, the inability to solve the educational issues, the inability to solve healthcare issues, right? We can't solve anything. It is striking that at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have personal protective equipment enough for our doctors and nurses, right? We weren't an advanced healthcare country. We were behind every other country in responding just by basic needs to what people say. And so I think the implication is less that there might be a tyranny than the prolonged inability of the state to be able to actually address or solve anything. And then Peterson may be right. Then you go out with a bang, because then something bad happens at some point. So but I agree completely with I agree completely with what you're saying, and the difference in those traditions, like the difference with the Roman traditions, probably points to a different set of ways in which the democracy goes. Although I'm not sure in 50 years what the democracy looks like. I know what it looks like in 10 years. I just don't know what it looks like in 50 years.
Thank you, Professor. Just for the record, I think that in that sense, we are, for different reasons, from different paths, Brazil will survive also, and we have to face all those inequalities that I think that one of the things that the coronavirus is acting like a contrast and used to make examine your body. Yeah. They are just showing all the problems that you have. We have a higher rates of mortality among poor people, ethnic minorities, and all this kind of people who doesn't have the same privilege from the rich people from big cities and stuff like that. But hopefully, we will survive. I think so. Mario, it's your turn now, man.
Okay. Professor, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very, very interesting. I have a more specific question regarding the history of political thought, particularly about the political thought of the nobilitas generation of Cicero, the last generation of the Roman Republic, to put it in Gruen's way. On 43 BC, Rufus was in Rome, Servius Sulpicius Rufus, a senator, was in Rome to attend the Senate, like Cicero and the other senators. And the meeting has two main themes, two motions. The first motion proposed sending legati from the Senate to Marco Antonius to trying to resolve the civil war, demanding that he withdraw his troops from Gaul. And the second motion, the motion of Cicero, would declare Antonio as an enemy, a hostage, and know all the roles he had enacted in his public life. But Rufus, against Cicero, he that the mission sent to Antonius as legati, and he tried like Pansa, the consul, make peace, make concordia with Antonio. Right. Cicero didn't like that. Cicero impatiently calls in a letter to Atticus, calls Rufus a pacificator, pacificator, and states that military strength is the only language that Antonius can understand. So I think that Rufus' position here is similar to that of Publius Mucius Scaevola on 133 BC in his consulship when he took position against the motion of Scipio Nasica. It was in both cases not just a policy of harmony or harmony between the nobles, but also a position that holds the argument of a binding force of the constitutional tradition of Mos Maiorum. Can we think that in Rufus' time, in Cicero and Rufus' time, the political and institutional tradition of the Middle Republic still represented in some way a possible but defeated position? A defeated one by autocracy, of course, but available in political language, or we may say, like Hannah Arendt on the end of modern political tradition and the position of Marx and Nietzsche, that the past Roman tradition could be understood as completely broken, even if Rufus or Scaevola were not aware of it at the time. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, interesting. And I will not answer that question definitively. Because but I will say I think what you're saying, right, is that what is being articulated, even as things are crumbling, right, are still these vestiges of particular norms, of particular Republican ideals, of ways in which, and it speaks to sort of the how important these sorts of informal norms are, that there was a tradition by which the nobility got along with each other. There was a tradition by which the nobility got along with the plebeians. There were these, and I think, you know, Cicero is clinging, I think, to those ideals, right. He tries to forge a peace, desperately tries to forge a peace. At one point, it goes nowhere because no one wants peace, and he's continuing to talk in this sort of language. I just recently did a very extended sort of encyclopedia entry on Cicero, and so I read actually all of his stuff sort of in order, and was really interesting, and hidden in some of his works on the orator or on some of the less sort of political things, not in the Philippics, for example, is the increasing sense that it's over, that there is. He compares himself at one point to a gladiator, fighting. Fighting for the res publica, fighting to the end, and he has it. I think he has an increasing. There's an increasing sort of desperation that not only are the norms over, but that he actually knows the people who are actually undermining and destroying those particular norms, and so. So I think that that's why it's so hard to figure out, right? That's why you can't tell when the Republic actually stops being the Republic, is because there are these fits and starts, right? There are these moments of autocracy, then it returns back to the people, and then there's another thing, and then it returns back. And I think that's what it looks like. I think that's the Whimper, right? Is that it's not a clean death. It goes back and forth, and it keeps getting put on a life support system. But the problem, right? The problem is the trend line, right? Is that each time you eliminate a norm or undermine a norm, it's very hard to get those norms back, right? If the Democrats win the Senate, do you think they're going to abide by a filibuster after essentially being screwed by it? They're not going to do that. The filibuster's done, right? The filibuster may not be that important, right? But it was a way of having some sort of compromise, right? You think if a Democrat becomes president, they're necessarily going to abide by every oversight request by the Republicans, not with the set of sort of traditions in place right now? Or are they going to start working suddenly to compromise and reaching sort of agreements on particular legislation so everyone still has those ideas in mind, right? But they aren't willing to subordinate their own anger, their own desires, their own interests to something that is greater than they are, to these sorts of norms. And the cases you're talking about are exactly those sorts of cases where a person wasn't willing to subordinate themselves to something else, but was acting solely on their interest. I mean, Cicero knew he was going to be in trouble, right? I mean, he gets his hands cut off eventually and hung up, right? That's sort of a moment when the compromising has reached an end. But I think you're absolutely right in what you're saying and what you're pointing to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Anyone else want to make a question? Well, Professor, I think that we can now let you go, saying thank you for your intervention. I'm pretty sure that not just about the things about Roman political thought, but also about the U.S. reality right now. I think that this lecture is being really interesting, and to all of us, thank you so much for your patience. And I hope that I just wish good luck for both our countries in facing the pandemic and all those Caesars with no legions. Fortunately, they don't have legions, right?
Fortunately, no. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, Trump has a long history, as one person had said. You go into business with Trump once, no one goes into business with Trump twice. And that's a very telling.
Michael Bloomberg have like a similar opinion on Trump. He knows something like I think that I'm trying to quote him that I know a crook when I meet one, and I know that he's a crook or something like that, right? He said that, right?
Yep.
So, but fortunately, they are crooks with no legions. So hopefully our republic's gonna be here for a while. And I hope to have you here in person when the pandemic is over. I hope that we have the opportunity to bring together all those scholars who are giving us those lectures through Zoom and in person in the future. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
Thank you.
And stay safe, everyone.
And yeah, you too. And stay at home. And we see you all, I hope, in the next session that we are planning yet. And we're gonna let you know, Professor, if you want to join for the next session also.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.